Hey everyone, it's Scott from Heroic Studios Gaming coming at you with another video. Today I'm going to be talking about Rivers of London, the book series. I kind of mentioned it in my review on Rivers of London, the RPG, but let's talk about the book series. So it's a book series by Ben Aaronovitch. It started in 2011 and with the first book called Rivers of London, but also called Midnight Riot in America. I don't know why we decided to change the name. Maybe we thought it was cooler, but it is about a midnight riot, so I guess it kind of makes sense. But it started in 2011, and it won a Galaxy Award, and it sort of encouraged the writer Ben Aaronovitch to go write more in the series. It kind of feels a little self-contained when you read book one, and then you start reading book two, and there's kind of like this weird change that kind of happens. It's not too weird. It's not like a complete juxtaposition or disjointing sort of continuation, but it does feel like the first book was a complete arc, and then it kind of goes into something else entirely starting from the second book forward. So that kind of happens with other books. It's very similar in style to the Dresden Files by Butcher Jim Butcher, and it's both in its content and kind of in its style a little different. In that it was written by someone who is British, and therefore there are certain aspects of the story that are different, right? Certain terminologies that are different, but mostly also some level of difference in the way that we as Americans have a culture versus the way that British people have a culture. For example, the sort of love and sex romance topic is kind of in a weird place in it, mostly because in England, for all of my friends have sort of let me know, it's not quite so open as it is in America. People still do it. They just don't talk about it as much. Like love life stuff is not really super talked about. But then also the interesting fact is that Ben Aaronovitch, his main character, whose name is Peter Grant, PC Peter Grant, he's a mixed race person. And so the story, like his mixed race background comes up quite a bit in the whole arc of all of these stories, which I find quite interesting because as far as I can tell, Ben Aaronovitch himself is not mixed race, so it was interesting to see it focused on so heavily in the book. But it also goes to say something about the English culture or the British culture and its sort of mix of other peoples that have been there since the sort of empire change, right? So where you might expect there to be like Hispanic people or German people a little bit more in, say, an American story, because we have this culture of like Hispanic culture and like being so close to Mexico and Spanish being our second language or whatever. In these stories, there's a lot more Indian people and such, which is pretty, I guess, more common there. I mean, obviously there wouldn't be any people from Mexico like very common in England, but there might be people from India or France or Germany, for example, because they're so close. So this is some differences, but essentially the Rivers of London follows a character, almost all of them. There's a series, there's like 9 books and some number of graphic novels. I forget the exact number off the top of my head. I think it's 12 or 11, something like that. But it follows the story of Peter Grant for the most part. The graphic novels kind of go elsewhere, and then the novellas, of which there are a few, I think there's 5, they kind of cover other characters, so you get a more rounded story. But for the most part, the story follows Peter Grant and Thomas Nightingale, who are essentially the only 2 police officers in the Metropolitan Police, the London Metropolitan Police, who do X-Files, essentially supernatural crimes. But as it started off that way, PC Peter Grant is a young officer he's a probationary officer, that's where PC comes from, probationary constable, for the Metropolitan Police. And on the very beginning of the first book, he's watching a site where a crime occurred. And he's just doing the job of securing the location, the very important but incredibly boring job of securing the location. And he encounters a ghost who tells him some of what he saw. The ghost being apparently an old copper, as they call him, an old cop. But that leads to him trying to explain that he saw a ghost, and he doesn't really know how to say it, because at first he's not even entirely sure he saw a ghost, but the fact that the person was a little translucent and then disappeared when his partner came up suggests to him that they're a ghost, but he doesn't know how to logic that out. Well, as it's kind of happening, the investigation continues to go forward. He discovers a detective, and a detective inspector actually, named Thomas Nightingale, who's looking into this. And he believes Peter's story and has him do some strange things in the investigation. He, being an inspector, makes it easy for the inspector to just grab a random, constable and say, "You're going to help me with this for a minute." And one of the things he has him do is feel out the vestigia, which is a thing that Peter is informed is essentially the residue left behind by magic. Now, I bring that up because in every one of the books, the presupposition by Ben Aaronovitch is that you haven't read the other books, and so he explains vestigia in every single book. But it's essentially the sense memory of magical stuff having happened, or things that are slightly magical in nature. And it turns out that there was, in fact, a magical aspect for the murder, and therefore there's vestigia. That leads Peter Grant to become a sort of probationary officer with the Special Assessment Unit, which is the name of the, metaphysical X-Files investigation unit for the Metropolitan Police, of which there is one member, Inspector Nightingale, and now there's two, because now Peter becomes a member of that. And so the story follows that investigation into that, and the cross paths that Peter has, where he starts finding out about all of these supernatural things that just live in London that he's never known about before, including, and this is the most important thing to this entire series, which is why it's called Rivers of London, the spirits of the rivers. And the spirits of the rivers are these things called genius locorum, or genie loci. They're essentially the idea that there's a spirit can develop in a place based on its importance to people and the energy that people give into it. So the more that people work with a river, for example, the more of a spirit it has, or the more it flows, the more of a spirit it gains. It's sort of like the idea of an egregor in a holy site, where the more people go there to worship it, the more that energy builds up. And then in this book series, they would become a spirit, right? So that's what they are. So he's navigating this investigation and discovers that there's all kinds of supernatural things, of which apparently some of them are criminal informants or informants for Nightingale, and some of them are just people. And the story involves him trying to navigate two different aspects. One, the crime that happened, and two, a building, which is kind of related to the crime, a building of some kind of diplomatic international relations problem between the spirits of the rivers of London, because there's apparently a divergence, and there are two spirits of the River Thames, and they have individual children who are split, and so it creates this sort of Mama and Papa Thames kind of problem that he's got to solve, but that's sort of solved in the later books. So that's really the first book, where he solves this crime and its magical components. And then from that point forward, we go to Moon over Soho, Whispers Underground, Broken Homes, Foxglove Summer, The Hanging Tree Lies Sleeping. Further stations listed here. There's actually more. It continues to go on to after Foxglove Summer. Hanging Tree Lies Sleeping. Then there's The October Man, False Value, Tales from the Folly, and Among Our Weapons as far as the books go. This is the set from Amazon. This was the only way I could find like as many of the books in one thing as I could. Apparently no one has all of them, and that has a little bit to do with the fact that False Value came out in 2020, Tales from the Folly was 2021, and Among Our Weapons came out in 2022. And there was also a book from 2023. It was called Winter's something or other. It's this sort of half sequel to Among Our Weapons, but it doesn't follow PC Peter Grant. It follows some other people, so I didn't include that one on here because that's one of those novellas, because it's like a half novel. It's not a full novel, and it basically takes place kind of concurrently with Among Our Weapons and follows some American supernatural investigators. So anyway, so they came out a little bit more recently, and so the whole series is not full yet. Like I guess you can't buy the whole box set of all of them right now, but soon maybe. But anyway, so the deal with the books, though, is that there's a very interesting investigation that begins in the second book, Moon over Soho, and further, where it starts to lay out some kind of grander conspiracy, which goes all the way to Lie Sleeping. Yeah, Lie Sleeping. Further Station, which is on here, is actually a half novel, too. It's a novella that takes place between Foxglove Summer and Hanging Tree, so it's actually in the wrong order. Should be above, should be like right over, it should be in front of the Hanging Tree, but it's not. But anyway, so after Lies Sleeping, the story ends. The whole story arc kind of ends. That has been created. So the following books, False Value and Among Our Weapons, follow different investigations. In fact, they're self-contained, much like the first book, and so it's a different thing. But so you have PC Peter Grant finding out about the Rivers of London and finding out what it means to be a member of what's called the Folly, which is the name of the essentially the police department version, the police department location of the Special Assessment Unit, which is also the home of a Royal Order of the Rose, or Intelligent Rose. I forget what the name of the organization is. So basically, it was a secret society that existed for a long, long time, sort of a gentleman's club society kind of thing. And then at some point, during the wars and stuff, they kind of legitimized and became part of the Metropolitan Police because they were the ones investigating things for the Queen, and they just got sort of looped into the Metropolitan Police Force when all that stuff happened in the post-war year. And then that's what makes Nightingale a police officer, essentially. But he's kind of not, he is a police officer, but he's mostly a gentleman who grew up rich and went to magic school. But then during the war, he became a soldier, did a bunch of stuff during the war, and when he came back, he was the only practitioner who had kind of not suffered from PTSD. He kind of did, but for the most part, he was fine. All the other ones who did survive, suffered PTSD, gave up their wands, essentially, and went back to being normal people who could do magic but just didn't. But that comes up later in the investigation where maybe not all of them did. And then that left just Thomas Nightingale to run this Metropolitan Police Station thing. He got older, because I mean World War II. He got older, and then suddenly, for whatever reason, the magic started surging through London, and he got younger. And so at the point that Peter Grant meets him, he's seems like he's a 40-year-old investigator, inspector, but he's not. He's a lot older than that. But that's neither here nor there. It does lead a question about whether or not Peter's going to get any older, so we're just going to keep getting books where Peter is sort of perpetually in his 20s because of the magic that is surging through him now. But in Moons Over Soho, they discover a person is killed, and they find this whole thing with the jazz clubs and stuff, this sort of weird underground thing with these people, but it also leads them to discover an old club, which they called the strip club of Dr. Moreau, because it was some kind of club that had cat boys and girls as strippers, essentially, for people's kind of sexual entertainment, which is where the book gets a little weird, right? But it continues to follow this line of investigation into that. And there's side investigations, like in Whispers Underground. It's mostly an investigation about a stabbed American who's found dead by stabbing. That leads to them investigating the underground, finding some things. But it does tie in the FBI and some business connections that they eventually discover were related to the strip club of Dr. Moreau. And then it leads to more of that. So the Broken Homes they follow those chains of shell companies that they start realizing, and they end up getting close to the Faceless Man who appears in Moon Over Soho. He's a wizard who uses some kind of magical abilities to hide his physical descriptions, and Peter and he get into a kind of wizard duel on a rooftop, and he realizes that Peter is not nearly as good as this other guy, which leads them to understand that one or more of the wizards who were part of the Folly back in the day, who, hung up their wands when they came back, maybe didn't, and they were teaching people stuff. And this guy is one of those dudes, which leads them to then investigate more and more. The shell companies are related. They're part of this Faceless Man's thing. And so the rest of them, Foxglove Summer and Hanging Tree and Lie Sleeping, are part of that investigation where they eventually find the person and have an epic duel with them. Following those, we have False Value, which is actually the story of Peter Grant going undercover and investigating a tech company. And it's a book where it addresses things like AI and stuff. It's very interesting to read in our current days where we have AI art and chat GPT and stuff, because that's basically the topic. Only in this case, instead of AI being these really great computer algorithms, there's a supernatural bent to them. So in Ben Aaronovitch's mind, there's no way to create a human consciousness, but there is a way to meld ghosts to create a spirit of a location kind of thing, which is essentially the same as an AI if it's contained within a computer. And that's sort of what Face Value is about, where he's trying to find out who's doing it and how are they doing it and what exactly are they doing. But that's what it comes down to. And then Among Our Weapons is the book that I just started. I haven't quite finished it, but I figured it was time to write this review anyway. But it covers Peter Grant, who's his girlfriend, who is one of the Rivers of London, is pregnant, and some stuff starts going on where there's a suspicious death. And so I haven't quite got far enough into that one, but it's an extra outside investigation than the main story. But there's also a bunch of graphic novels, which, as far as I can tell, and I've read one of them, as far as I can tell, they're just a bunch of short stories that Ben Aaronovitch wrote that he didn't want to develop into full stories. And some people were like, well, we can turn these into comic books. And so then they took the comic books, they released them as issues, and then they combined them into graphic novels. So there's Bodywork, which is about a car on a killing spree. Night Witch, which is about some characters that do appear in Broken Homes and The Hanging Tree and stuff. It's about some Russians and and a person named Vavra Sidorovna and that kind of thing. It takes place between Foxglove Summer and The Hanging Tree. Black Mold, which is about another character who ends up kind of joining the Folly, and later in the later books, because I didn't read the graphic novel before I read this, she shows up as kind of somebody in the background in some of the later books. Detective Stories is really just a bunch of short stories of Peter Grant going out and being a detective and getting ready for his detective constable's exam, which I can't remember which way it is. Hanging Tree, I think. It starts off and he's apparently been promoted, which we didn't hear about, and these are the short stories that follow that. Cry Fox is just involves more stuff with a particular character that they kind of came up against in the books. And they, it's just this character that they met in the books named Reynard, and some of the things that he's up to in their investigation of that. Then there's one that's actually mostly the short story of some of the rivers doing river spirits doing river spirit stuff. And then, there's that. At a Distance is jumps back in time to it's a story that follows Thomas Nightingale and his investigation into a serial killer in 1957. So we get to see more of what Nightingale was up to after the war, when he was the only person running the Folly. Then there's Fay and Furious, which is essentially Fast and the Furious spoof with the Rivers of London on it. Peter Grant is investigating illegal street racing. I haven't read that one, but that's kind of what is apparently, and it follows right after Lies Sleeping, so it's basically after he's finally caught the Faceless Man and he's trying to figure out what to do with himself. He starts investigating some things, and then we lead to the start of False Value, where he's undercover doing undercover work. And then Monday, which is another situation where there's detectives that work with the Folly that are undercover investigating werewolves. So that's really it. Yeah, that's everything for you. So these series of books, this is pretty long, but I just covered a bunch of books and graphic novels. They're essentially very interesting if you like urban fantasy. It's done really well. I do like that at one point it gets weird with some of the weird strip clubby sex thing, and then it's just the one, and then it kind of forgets about it, right? Because what it feels like too, when I was reading it, it feels like that Ben Aaronovitch himself was uncomfortable writing about it because he's British, apparently. Because of that thing I was saying where they don't really talk about it. And I've confirmed with some friends before I made this that I was accurate in my understanding of that, because it's not really as openly discussed. Like, hookup culture is pretty common in America, and people do hook up in England. They just don't really talk about it. And so you get a lot of people who are a little bit more polite and closed off in that kind of regard. And so there's this, it's sort of awkward. Some of the bits in there that are like that are a little awkward. And then we don't really hear about any sexual related stuff until Broken Homes, where we get some. I mean, it involves some things that are important, and then, that kind of doesn't really come up again later. Peter Grant's girlfriend gets pregnant. We get some idea that they sleep together, but it's very much fade to black, where he wakes up, like, it's like she meets him in his apartment, right, and they're arguing, and then the next chapter starts with them waking up in the morning in bed together, right? So we don't really get that good stuff, which is great because it was better than the way it was before. overall, it's essentially what like the Dresden Files would be if they took place in London instead of Chicago. So it's essentially that, which is great. It's actually pretty good. I like the idea of it being like X-Files light, because they're not federal investigators, but they might as well be, because there's no one else like them in all of England. There's no other thing. However, they do start discovering that there are some others that do magic around, and there's actually some secret groups. And then there's this Vavra Sidorovna, who's a witch, a night witch, who's a Russian magic user who also is in the background doing things. In fact, some things that they are investigating tie directly into the things that she's done in the past, so they cross paths and realize that she's actually an ally, so they kind of work with her. And so there's this sort of growing thing that they call the demimonde, which is everything that's supernatural that isn't a practitioner. And so they start sort of piecing together and bringing together all of these elements to work together to solve investigations. Very good series of stories, so I give it 2 thumbs. I would recommend it. It's very fun, very whimsical. There's spirits and fairies and satyrs and weird stuff and goblins and dwarves and all kinds of things. But in like modern situations, like dwarves do live underground, but what do you have in underground in London? You have the underground, which is the subway. And yes, in fact, the dwarves and the underground in London are related to each other. There's a connection between them. So it's actually pretty interesting to read. So I would give 2 thumbs up. 20 minutes to tell you, read these books, and there you go. Now you have everything you need to know. And I didn't spoil too much of a plot because you've got stuff to read. I didn't really tell you a whole lot, so you can go find out what those books contain yourself. See you later, everybody.